He was one of America's best essayists. He authored Stuart Little and Charlotte's Web. In The Elements of Style, he advised new writers to place yourself in the background, write with verbs and nouns, and avoid fancy words. His name, of course, was E.B. White. Elwyn Brooks White was born in 1899 on 7/11. Numbers he considered lucky. His parents, Samuel and Jessie, now in their 40s, were from Brooklyn and had moved to 101 Summit Avenue in Mount Vernon, New York, to start a family. The name Elwyn is Welsh. His mother, Jessie, had borrowed it from a woman she'd met whose baby bore that name. As White explains,
I never liked Elwyn. My mother just hung it on me because she'd run out of names. I was her 6th child.
As a boy, Elwyn went by the nickname of N. His middle name, Brooks, came from the famous Episcopal minister Phillips Brooks, who was based in Boston. The family was well off. Samuel White was vice president and later president of a piano company, Horace Waters & Co. However, there was a lawsuit that tainted his success and affected his health. Samuel had advised the founder's son to issue 3 shares of stock to a longtime employee. But when the stock was issued, the founder's son was no longer majority shareholder and felt swindled. A lawsuit of fraud was brought against Samuel White. After appeals and 6 years of trial, the state Supreme Court ruled the issuing of stock illegal, but not fraudulent. Samuel White was off the hook. Thanks to Samuel's prosperity, he was able to buy Elwyn the first bicycle any child owned on the block. When Elwyn was 11, his father bought him an Old Town canoe to use on Great Pond in North Belgrade, Maine, where the family vacationed every August. Through Samuel, Elwyn learned to respect the privacy, independence, and self-realization of every member in the family. Perhaps the family was too private. According to Elwyn,
nobody got into our fashionable house unless he was kinfolks, and even then he had to beat his way in. I might as well have been living in the rainforest.
Elwyn's sisters described their mother, Jessie, as a typical Victorian mother. Her children were her all-consuming interest. Of Scottish ancestry, Jessie was a shy and simple person, whose father, William Hart, was a successful landscape painter. During blizzards, when the fire siren wailed the no-school signal, Elwyn would retreat to the attic and play with his Meccano set, or inspect the collection of birds' eggs up there, from ostrich to hummingbird. At one point, he had a pet mouse. With Elwyn's 2 older sisters married and gone, the remaining children were able to have their own room. His brother Stanley had a typewriter in his.
It was the noisy excitement connected with borrowing and using the machine that encouraged me to be a writer.
Elwyn's room was always shipshape. Downstairs, the parlor was filled with musical instruments, like pianos, mandolins, and drums. Music always filled the house, none of it good. Everyone liked the sound of music, but was too lazy to follow it to its source. In regard to the basement,
as a very small boy, I used to repair to the cellar where I would pee in the coal bin, for variety.
His companion was his dog Mac. Elwyn had built him a sheepskin-lined house in the barn for winter, and Mac always met him on the street after school. At various times, the barn had pigeons, ducks, geese, and a turkey. One spring day, Samuel bought the children an incubator and 50 eggs. The day the chicks began to hatch, their coachman called them to come and see. Elwyn, so small he could barely look over the table, was most excited of all. When all but 3 eggs hatched, the coachman put them on the manure pile outside. Wondrously, these eggs also hatched. Weekends were spent with trips to matinees in New York, to the Hippodrome, and Bronx Zoo. By the time Elwyn was 12, all of his siblings had moved out of the house. Periods of boredom and anxiety set in. He stopped attending church and Sunday school. As for grammar school, he'd wanted out since kindergarten. One teacher, however, Mrs. Schuyler, delighted him whenever she entered a room. But she was not enough to cure his fears of public speaking. For assembly performances, the students were called alphabetically, but usually the term ended before Elwyn's name came up. He only had to speak once his whole career. The rest of the time, he was severely anxious about being called. His summer vacations in Belgrade, Maine, made the other 9 months bearable. Summer decreased his anxiety. He took comfort in caring for pets and spending time in nature. He revered the phenomenon of reproduction and had great faith in biology, more so than religion. The egg was his symbol of faith, the boat his symbol of freedom. Observations Elwyn made regarding nature and everything else were recorded on paper. Writing became a way he could express clearly what he saw, heard, felt, and thought, which gave him a feeling of fulfillment. In 1909, he'd won a prize from the Woman's Home Companion for a poem about a mouse. He won more prizes from St. Nicholas magazine, and diary entries became a habit. But these early achievements did not instill him with self-confidence. By the time he got to Mount Vernon High School, he was deathly afraid of failure. He had good friends, could write better than his classmates, skate, swim, and canoe with the best of them, but he was afraid to speak to girls he liked, forgot his speech in a debate, and failed to make the track team. At parties, he felt ill at ease. He also developed hypochondria. For summers in high school, he got a job as a caddy, and later as a rod man for a surveyor in Lake Placid, where Stanley worked as a landscape architect. Senior year, he became assistant editor of The Oracle, the school literary magazine. He joined a fraternity and played a bit role of an English butler in a Panero farce. In spite of the courage it takes to be on stage, by his own acknowledgement, Elwyn was socially awkward.
In the matter of girls, I was different from most boys my age. I admired girls a lot, but they terrified me. I didn't feel that I possessed the peculiar gifts or accomplishments that girls liked in their male companions. The ability to dance, to play football, to cut up a bit in public, to smoke, and to make small talk.
That being said, he did take a girl to a tea dance at the Plaza Hotel, and went ice skating with another on Siwanoy Pond, on the outskirts of Mount Vernon. He graduated in 1917, but decided to wait until he was drafted before joining any military. His body weight was below regulation anyway. Instead, his sights were set on Cornell, the college his brothers had gone to. Even with a school picked out, though, he had no concrete plans for his future, and this lack of faith in himself upset him. The first day on campus didn't help matters. In Morrill Hall, he stood waiting in line to get a form, but when he reached over the desk where he thought the form was, the registrar, Mr. Hoy, coiled and sprang, calling him a thief. He roared like a crazy man, so Elwyn went back to Sheldon Court, packed, crying, and prepared to leave. When emotions cooled, he wrote Hoy a note of explanation and apology, and received a reassuring reply. He entered Cornell with 2 scholarships, totaling $1,000, at a time when tuition was only $50 a semester. At college, his fears did not leave him, but he learned to live with them. As Elwyn writes,
My English professor said the other day that bashfulness was a form of vanity. The only difference being that vanity is the tendency to overestimate your worth, and bashfulness to underestimate it, both arising from the overindulgence of self-consciousness.
Elwyn's time at Cornell was mainly positive. He was elected president of Phi Gamma Delta and became editor-in-chief of the student paper, the Cornell Daily Sun. His fellow staffers were so impressed they began calling him Andy, after Andrew D. White, the college's president, a name Elwyn kept for the rest of his life. Junior year, he took Professor William Strunk's famous course, English 8. Strunk was a memorable man, friendly and funny, who wielded a kindly lash. His ideas about the sanctity of the English sentence were simple. He loved the clear, the brief, the bold, and scorned the vague, the tame, the irresolute. He felt it was worse to be irresolute than to be wrong. His classes used a privately printed 43-page pamphlet called The Elements of Style, which shouted at students to omit needless words. Andy got to know Strunk informally at meetings with the Manuscript Club. Another hangout spot for students was the home of Professor Bristow Adams, who taught journalism. Adams would prove the stronger influence on young Andy White. Adams tried to impart the belief that there is more fun in the journey than in the destination. Another professor, historian George Lincoln Burr, in lecturing about the hardships of the Middle Ages, impressed upon Andy the vitality of man living in a free society. It shaped Andy's humanistic convictions about the nature and value of freedom in a way that indirectly pointed him toward the profession of writing to express those convictions. In spring semester 1921, Andy launched a campaign in the paper to establish a student-administered honor system for reporting and punishing plagiarism. Cornell's widespread cheating on exams indicated the school might not be ready for such a measure. But the plan was approved by a student referendum and approved by all faculty without a dissenting vote. After it passed, Andy stepped down from editorship. As he put it,
"The man obsessed with activity loses his receptive powers. He can't merely enjoy."
There was also a girl. Alice Birchfield, nicknamed Birch, was a pretty and bright junior from Buffalo, New York. She had a happy and outgoing temperament and a smile that was almost a grin. She was a chemistry major whose life revolved around theater. Andy took her for walks along 6 Mile Creek, to movies, and to ball games. He wrote her poetry and published it in The Sun. He was a little scared, but she had the maturity to encourage his friendship. Upon graduation, no profession, except that of an artist, appeared to him more valuable, though he was drawn to journalism as a close second. For the summer, he worked as a counselor at Camp Otter, near Dorset, Ontario, owned by the director of phys ed at Cornell. In fall, he tried to find a job that would keep him in Ithaca during Alice's senior year, but had no luck. On his last night in town, they watched for shooting stars, and she walked him to the trolley that would take him to his train. He promised to write as soon as he found a job. He interviewed with the Post, the Sun, and the Edison Company. When he put an ad in its editor and publisher, the editor of that very trade journal was so impressed, he gave Andy several letters of recommendation. Finally, Andy got a job as a reporter for United Press. A week later, he quit. He was supposed to cover the funeral of Senator Philander C. Knox in Valley Forge, but got on the wrong train. Andy's sense of failure was mixed with relief at having regained his freedom. He really didn't want to write for anyone but himself. He lived with his parents in their new home on Mercereau Avenue in Mount Vernon, while more brief jobs came and went. From his room, he wrote Alice about his disappointments. Alice expressed concern and asked Andy to come to Ithaca for the last game of the season. The meeting was awkward and frustrating. In March, Andy made good on his plans with friend Howard Cushman for taking a road trip. Andy bought a Model T Ford and dubbed it Hotspur. He sprung the news on his parents last minute. His mother was shocked by the suddenness of it all, but Samuel was more flexible. Andy and Cush stopped off in Ithaca for Andy to see Alice on her way to class, but she never appeared. She was sick with a cold. Even worse, Andy heard a rumor she was engaged. So, he cranked up Hotspur and left for Buffalo. There, he and Cush spent a month living at Cush's parents' house. When Alice came home to Buffalo, Andy called on her, asking her to marry him. Alice was surprised. She revealed she was not engaged, but in love with someone else. Furthermore, she received so many mixed signals from Andy, she was unsure of his love for her. Andy explained he wanted to propose a year ago at senior week, but had no money and no prospect of getting any. They parted amicably, and her mother told her to save his letters because he was a promising writer. Andy and Cush hopscotched across the country, from Ohio to Kentucky to Indiana and Wisconsin, staying in hospitable fraternities. When they settled into the Beta House at the University of Minnesota, they were down to their last 76 cents and did odd jobs to make money, like writing students' papers for them and selling articles to newspapers. In Walker, Minnesota, Andy slipped on some pine needles and dislocated his elbow. In Hardin, Montana, he played piano in a cafe. In Cody, Wyoming, he sandpapered a dance floor and worked at a carnival. In Alberta, Canada, he sold Cush's typewriter for a spare tire. In Yakima, Washington, he and Cush worked on a farm for a month, picking fruit. Samuel White wrote Andy to sell Hotspur and to come home by train. Cush eventually did, but Andy was not done, heading west. In Seattle, a former employer, Carl Helm, who taught him how to write press releases in New York at the American Legion, referred Andy to the Seattle Times. Andy's new boss was Mr. Johns. Once, when Andy got stuck on a story and couldn't find a way to express what he meant, Johns thought for a minute and then said, "Just say the words." Johns soon took Andy off reporting and had him write feature stories. It was a stroke of luck, for Andy was lonely in Seattle after Cush left. More luck came when the Times asked Andy to create a small daily column. He wasn't allowed a byline, but was excited nonetheless. Back in a time when everyone read newspapers, readers looked forward to daily communications from a familiar voice, such as FPA's The Conning Tower in the New York World, Christopher Morley's Bowling Green in the New York Post, and Don Marquis's Sundial in the New York Sun. It turned out Andy's column, with all of its constraints, wasn't the right medium for his muse. He was fired in June. He was told the dismissal was in no reflection on his ability, but he didn't believe it. Andy had traded in Hotspur for a Ford Coupe, bought a new typewriter, and visited the zoo. He and Alice wrote letters back and forth, though he did not encourage her efforts. He wanted to keep traveling. He hopped on the SS Buford on a 40-day cruise that would take its passengers around the Bering Sea. However, he only had enough money to make it to Skagway, Alaska. He asked the ship's officers for a job, but they met him with rejection. When the ship reached Skagway, Andy packed his bag. On deck, he lingered by the gangplank, forlornly watching the other passengers go. Suddenly, a girl tapped him on the shoulder. He had danced with her one night when they'd first left Seattle. Her father was one of the ship owners, and the captain would like to see him. He got a job as saloon boy, and within a few hours he was serving the people he'd earlier been on equal first-class terms with. Another victory came when the ship entered 3 days of rough waters, and everyone got sick, but him. After the ship docked at Seattle, Andy boarded a train for home. Before he left, one of his friends had written Andy with a difficult observation, saying that Andy was not looking for love, but running from it. Perhaps Andy was, perhaps not. What he really wanted was to find a career. In any event, Andy had promised to see Alice in Buffalo, and did just that. The reunion was uncomfortable. Alice had tonsillitis. Andy talked about the weather. She wanted to be convinced that he loved her, and had even mailed him a letter he didn't receive, implying that if he were to propose again, she would say yes. Andy decided he was no longer in love with her. 5 months after his return, he left Alice no room for misunderstanding and closed that chapter of his life. At the age of 24, Andy was back home and lonely. He soon got a job as a layout man at Frank Seaman's ad agency in Manhattan. It was a job that didn't require his writing skills and paid him less than the Seattle Times had. But he was getting his poems published in the Bowling Green and Conning Tower. In February 1925, he was passing through Grand Central Station when he bought a new magazine a friend of his had told him to be on the lookout for, The New Yorker. 9 weeks later, the funny little magazine published Andy's first contribution, a short piece on the coming of spring, as if written from the perspectives of 6 different copywriters. A few weeks later, editor Harold Ross published a 400-word piece called Defense of the Bronx River by E.B. White. To launch the magazine, Harold Ross got financial backing from Raoul Fleischman, a young businessman from a wealthy family of bakers. As suggested in its magazine, The New Yorker was not for the old lady in Dubuque. But who was it for? Harold Ross didn't have a clear vision for what shape the magazine would take. In summer, Andy quit his job at Frank Seaman's ad agency and moved into Greenwich Village at 112 West 13th Street with 3 Cornell frat brothers. For leisure, he bought a 20-foot catboat named the Pequod and took it sailing on the north shore of Long Island.
One afternoon, we anchored at slack tide off a pleasant spot and swam ashore. We were met by a man with a gun. He explained that it was Mr. J.P. Morgan's place and not for people who came out of the sea dripping.
Soon, he was at another ad agency, J.H. Newmark, but this time he was actually writing copy about a new automobile called the Star. In the last issue of 1925, The New Yorker published his story, Child's Play, about a waitress at Child's restaurant that spills a glass of buttermilk on the author's blue serge suit. The author reacts like Charlie Chaplin, pretending not to be offended and comforting the tearful waitress. It was a self-mocking story of personal triumph. After submitting 2 more pieces, written in an informal style that Ross liked to call casuals, Andy was summoned to The New Yorker on suggestion of Ross's editorial assistant, Catherine Angel. She was 33, married, with 2 children. "Are you Elwyn Brooks White?" she asked, in her Bostonian accent. He was. Though formidable, Catherine was lovely and had a way of making a young contributor feel at ease. She offered him a staff job. Andy was non-committal. His flatmate, Bob Adams, worked for the Cunard Line and offered him free passage, all expenses paid, to join a tour of Europe organized for college students and to write the script for a promotional movie shot en route. Andy said yes. When he returned, Catherine contacted him. Andy had several lunches with her and with Ross before he agreed to take on the job. One of his first pieces was Life Cycle of a Literary Genius, beginning with showing precocity writing at age 6 and ending with dying of nervous indigestion, leaving behind an illegitimate son who grows up in obscurity and writes the great American novel. Andy's job at The New Yorker was to edit the funny column fillers, called news breaks, help revise the talk of the town pieces, and invent captions for cartoons. Within a month, Ross discovered that E.B. White was a writer whose style could give the magazine the humorous voice it needed. When Ross and Andy met, they were 34 and 27. Ross was from a mining town in Colorado. He had worked for 18 newspapers and 3 national magazines. He had no formal education, but spent his life reading to catch up. He cursed, loved practical jokes, and was certainly intelligent. According to Andy,
Ross never really grew up. His honesty, his self-assurance, his playfulness, his restlessness, his terrible temper, his awkwardness, and his idealism were all expressions of a basic innocence.
Ross just wanted a magazine that was good and funny and fair. A few months later, Andy dropped his other job at Newmark and focused on newsbreaks. Newsbreaks were little excerpts from newspapers that were accidentally funny for containing some error of typography or judgment. Andy's job was to leave a humorous comment after each one. The concept of news breaks came from the British magazine Punch and had been going on for 50 years. Andy developed a new concept called Answers to Hard Questions. In the notes and comments section, White used the editorial pronoun of we. He appeared to be speaking for the whole magazine, but in fact only spoke for himself. He ribbed President Coolidge, Mayor Walker, and the Bureau of Internal Revenue. Ross allowed humor to infect everything. In 1927, Ross hired James Thurber. Thurber was 5 years older than White, born in Columbus, Ohio, and had a troubled marriage. Where White was a quiet, reserved, and private person, modest about his talents, careful to say or write no more than he meant, Thurber was voluble, gregarious, and extravagant. Thurber's humor was wild, his love was large, and his resentments ran deep. He was also blind in one eye. White had said,
"There never was a kinder, nicer friend, when he was sober."
White taught Thurber how to write talk pieces, and Thurber regarded White highly. By the end of 1927, White had made $10,000, 6 times that of the year before. In the romance department, his flirtation with a Southern girl named Mary Osborne had gone sour. It was all a matter of course, for he was starting to develop feelings for Catherine Angel. He wrote failed poems about her in the New Yorker, commenting on how so much stands between them. Realizing this was a dead end, Andy shifted his attention to a 19-year-old secretary named Roseanne Magdal. He wrote a funny piece about her called Rubbing Elbows, where she wanted to literally rub elbows with every famous person she encountered. Whatever she and Andy had together, though, fizzled out. Then, something happened. Catherine fell in love with Andy. Catherine and her husband Ernest, along with their 2 children, were going to Paris for a month. Ernest would see an old flame from his war days. Catherine wanted to know if Andy would like to meet her there. Andy took her canoeing on the Seine and went to Saint-Tropez, then Corsica. Upon return to New York, Andy wrote a couple of poems about the hopelessness of it all. He wanted to leave the New Yorker. Instead, he bought a Model A Ford Roadster and went to Maine to ice skate and get away for a while. When he got back to New York, he found Catherine had moved out of her home in uptown Manhattan and into the Angel summer house at Sneeden's Landing. She had decided on divorce. It would be less harmful to her children, she reasoned, than to constantly expose them to arguments with her husband. Ernest professed his love to get her to stay. His family and hers pressured her from all sides. Since divorce was not so easy in those days, she took off for Nevada by train, lived in Reno for 3 months, then filed. While she was gone, Andy found her an attractive apartment in Greenwich Village. However, a lot of uncertainty and ambivalence marked Andy's letters to Catherine regarding their relationship and his feelings toward the New Yorker. He'd mastered every form of writing the magazine produced, had turned 30, and wanted to try his talents at something greater. By the time Catherine arrived in New York, Andy was at Camp Otter. When they finally reunited, their relationship hung in limbo. Andy had cut back on his contributions to the New Yorker and published a book with Thurber called Is Sex Necessary? Or Why You Feel the Way You Do. It was a parody of some of the works on sex produced by doctors and psychiatrists that had recently flooded the market. White recommended Thurber's drawings to Harper & Brothers, which, after some convincing, were included, thus bolstering Thurber's artistic talent in Ross's eyes. Ross had never published Thurber's art before this point. One fine Wednesday morning in November 1929, Andy walked down Fifth Avenue to Catherine Angel's apartment to discuss whether or not to get married. Andy writes,
I don't remember how Ivy got into the discussion, but potted plants have never been far removed from Catherine's thoughts. Anyway, when I heard the word ivy, I said petulantly, "Oh, let the ivy rest." Well, Kay's whole manner changed. Instead of slamming the ball back over the net at me, she replied in a mild and thoughtful voice, "That sounds like the name of an English country house." At this point, I decided she was the girl for me, and the hell with the obstacles. So after some badgering, she agreed to it, and we spent the rest of the day getting married. No mean feat.
After collecting the divorce papers and reorganizing their schedules, Andy and Catherine were married in a Presbyterian church in Bedford Village. While the ceremony was underway, Daisy, Catherine's Scottish Terrier, got into a scrap with the minister's police dog. Back in New York, they had dinner at Marta's Italian restaurant on Washington Place. When Nancy Angel, Catherine's 11-year-old daughter, heard of her mother's marriage from an aunt, she was terribly upset. Nancy and her brother Roger had met White only once. The children, in the custody of their father, had been spending weekends with their mother at her apartment, and it was there they met their new stepfather on the first Saturday following the wedding. Andy's parents were not too fond of his marriage to a divorcee with 2 children. They were just getting over his "Is Sex Necessary" book. In time, they would hear Catherine was pregnant and accept Nancy and Roger as part of Andy's family. Andy grew close to Nancy and Roger, but let it happen naturally. He knew their father despised him. Andy moved into Catherine's apartment at 16 East 8th Street, the one he'd found her while she was in Nevada. Their son, Joel McCown White, was born on December 21st, 1930. The following year, Andy came up with a new concept for the magazine called Preposterous Parables. As for Catherine, she was discovering and editing new talent. She was the first at the New Yorker to buy work from Vladimir Nabokov, John Updike, and John Cheever. The magazine prospered right through the Depression, with a circulation of 125,000 and profits of over $500,000. In the summer of 1933, while yachting off the coast of Maine, they spotted a farm that piqued their interest. The next day, they passed a house with a for sale sign in front of it. It was the same farm. Located in the town of Brooklyn, Maine, it had a 12-room house, a barn, outbuildings, and 40 acres of land that ran down to a cove. It was theirs at once. Andy retained the same caretaker and hired Captain Percy Moore to build a dock. These decisions were followed by the purchase of a 30-foot double-ended cutter called Astrid. But everything wasn't smooth sailing. White had gone to Cornell Medical Center to examine the cause of his chronic gastritis. His stomach had been easily upset for most of his life. He also suffered from periods of depression, but he didn't let it stop him from returning to write notes and comments for The New Yorker. In 1934, Harper published Every Day is Saturday, a selection of pieces from that very segment. In 1935, The New Yorker moved its offices from 25 West 45th Street to the National Association building at 25 West 43rd Street. Sometimes, when a visitor called on him in the waiting room, White would sneak out his window and climb down the fire escape to avoid seeing them. Later the same year, White and Catherine moved into a house uptown in Turtle Bay Gardens. Around this time, White's father passed away. His mother followed 9 months later in spring 1936. They died before he felt he had fulfilled his promise as a writer. By 1938, White and Catherine decided to give up the New York house and live in Maine. White also switched magazines, from The New Yorker to Harper's. It meant no longer writing anonymously. Ross did everything he could to keep White on. White agreed to continue writing news breaks, but dropped everything else. His new monthly column at Harper's would be titled, One Man's Meat. Catherine gave up her job as the head of fiction and was relegated to editing part-time, a move that was difficult for her. But think of the trade-off. To White, the farm was a life-size toy, filled with sheep, a ram, chickens, geese, a dog, a tomcat, a mouse, and pigs. He said he was suited physically to be a writer, but psychologically to be a farmer. Some of his One Man's Meat essays involved his rustic life on the farm, but the majority are on other subjects, like Jim Crow, the impending war, and his idol, Henry David Thoreau. In 1938 and 39, he published 2 collections, one of poetry and one of satirical essays. The Fox of Peapack didn't sell very well, but Quo Vadis did. White was praised for his clarity of style and for being a rare essayist. In 1942, Harper and Brothers published a collection of his magazine essays titled One Man's Meat, which received excellent reviews. Some called White a modern Montaigne. Others called him a modern Thoreau. When the Council on Books in Wartime selected it, they printed 250,000 copies for the armed services. Also in 1942, after war broke out in Europe, White wrote an old Cornell classmate, John Fleming, and offered his services as a writer. Fleming was deputy director of the Office of Facts and Figures in Washington. Archibald MacLeish, the director of OFF, accepted. So did FDR. He was planning to have a pamphlet written called The Four Freedoms. Reinhold Niebuhr would write on freedom of religion, Max Lerner on freedom of fear, Malcolm Cowley on freedom from want, and White on freedom of speech. White was also to write the entire manifesto on all 4 freedoms, from notes he would take during the committee's conference, as well as drafts from the other 3 writers. During the conference, White's stomach was acting up and making him dizzy, a recurring event in his life now. Plowing through the pain, he was able to finish the job in 3 weeks. Everyone was satisfied. After this episode, Ross wanted White as a steady contributor. He and Catherine agreed, got a flat, and spent their time between Maine and New York. The New Yorker had slowly been breaking its policy to avoid politics. When Life magazine stated in an open letter to the people of England what they needed to do if they wanted America's help, White published his own article in the New Yorker stating that Life does not speak for America. At first, White was anti-war, but changed his tune as America entered. White also advocated for world government. He believed it was the answer to all the violence. In 1945, the New Yorker sent White to the San Francisco Conference, a meeting that was to give birth to the United Nations. Later, in 1946, Houghton Mifflin published White's collection of writing on this very topic, titled The Wild Flag. It sold 15,000 copies. In the spring of 1943, he quit One Man's Meat. It was around this time that Catherine had undergone a hysterectomy. Joel left for boarding school, and White had a nervous crack-up. He felt his returning to the New Yorker was a step backward. For all his time spent in Maine, he had failed to produce the original work he'd hoped to write. Or so he thought, as White recounts.
In the late 20s, I took a train to Virginia, then returned to New York by rail. While asleep in an upper berth, I dreamed of a small character who had the features of a mouse, was nicely dressed, courageous, and questing. When I woke up, being a journalist and thankful for small favors, I made a few notes about this mouse child, the only fictional figure ever to have honored and disturbed my sleep.
White wrote a few episodes for his 18 nieces and nephews. He even shopped the story around for years. At last, it was Harper that published it, in 1945. Stuart Little is about the adventures of the youngest son of Mr. and Mrs. Frederick C. Little of New York City. He sails a model sailboat in a race on the pond in Central Park and falls in love with a hen bird named Margalo. When Margalo flies away, Stuart decides to leave home and search for her. On his quest, he meets Harriet, a mouse-sized girl he plans to take canoeing. When his plans are foiled and reality doesn't measure up to his ideal, Harriet leaves him to continue his search. The story ends with Stuart heading north. A few weeks after turning in the manuscript, Anne Carroll Moore, the children's librarian of New York Public Library, wrote to White urging him to withdraw the book. Moore's stamp of approval was widely considered final judgment for the reading public, so this was a big deal. She didn't like Stuart's inconclusive ending. White writes,
I'd followed my instincts in writing about Stuart, and following one's instincts seems to be the way a writer should operate. I was shook up by the letter, but was not deflected.
Moore reviewed the book unfavorably as predicted, but the library decided to carry it. As White put it, Stuart had to gnaw his way in. As for everyone else's reviews, much of the press, for some reason, treated Stuart Little like adult fiction. One day at the office, Ross approached White. "Saw your book, White. You made one serious mistake. Why the mouse? You said he was born. God damn it, White, you should have had him adopted." White's next encounter was with Edmund Wilson, who stopped him in the hall. Hello. I read that book of yours. I found the first page quite amusing. About the mouse, you know? But I was disappointed that you didn't develop the theme more in the manner of Kafka." Despite the rough time White was having, Stuart Little sold 42,000 copies by the end of the month. White also received a ton of fan mail, some with praise, others with abuse over the ending. White writes,
I learned two things from the experience: that a writer's own nose is his best guide, and that children can sail easily over the fence that separates reality from make-believe.
He spent his time between Maine and New York. On one occasion, he took his family to the Blue Hill Fair, where his son Joel took a 13-year-old girl for a ride on the Ferris wheel. A moment White filed away for later. In 1947, after years of White asking, Ross gave White his own signed column in The New Yorker, called Turtle Bay Diary. White was against the House Un-American Activities Committee, afraid of the atom bomb, and loved the Bronx Zoo. His opinions went straight into his writing. In the summer of 1948, White sat in the Algonquin Hotel and, sweltering in the heat, wrote a remarkable, pristine essay for Holiday magazine titled Here is New York. Perceptive, funny, and nostalgic, White's stroll around Manhattan with the reader arm in arm remains the quintessential love letter to the city. By 1949, White wished once more to live free. He wanted to live in the present moment and work patiently instead of rapidly. He gave up his editorial duties at The New Yorker and wrote his editor at Harper to say the next book was in sight. As White explains,
I like animals, and it would be odd if I failed to write about them. Farm is a peculiar problem for a man who likes animals, because the fate of most livestock is that they're murdered by their benefactors. The creatures may live serenely, but they end violently, and the odor of doom hangs about them always. I've kept several pigs, starting them in the spring as weanlings and carrying trays to them all through the summer and fall. But the relationship bothered me. Day by day, I became better acquainted with my pig and he with me, and the fact that the whole adventure pointed toward an eventual piece of double dealing on my part lent an eerie quality to the thing.
Charlotte's Web is about a pig named Wilbur, who is saved by a spider named Charlotte. Charlotte makes Wilbur's owner, Mr. Zuckerman, believe that Wilbur is an exceptional pig by writing words into the webs in the corner of the doorway to Wilbur's home in the cellar of the barn. There is much inspiration taken from White's life, his barn, the Blue Hill Fair, his love of animals. But one can argue the most direct influence on Charlotte's Web would be the similarity between Charlotte and the character Mehitabel from Archie and Mehitabel. Archie is a cockroach. Mehitabel is an alley cat. The characters appeared in verse form in Don Marquis's column, Sundial, at the New York Sun. Charlotte and Mehitabel are always the lady, always cheerful. They have independence, self-confidence, wit, tough-minded generosity, and loyalty to themselves. There was also a real spider that inspired White. As White recalls,
I'd made up my mind to write a children's book about animals, and I needed a way to save a pig's life. And I'd been watching a large spider in the back house. And what with one thing and another, the idea came to me.
A month later, he observed the same spider laying her eggs and got the idea of how to end the book. He even took the egg sac with him to New York, where tiny spiders emerged and strung tiny lines across his dresser. Arachnologist Willis J. Gersh identified White's spider as a barn spider. Everyone at Harper was sure the book would be a hit, and the book's editor, Ursula Nordstrom, didn't let her admiration hinder her judgment. She persuaded White to change the title of the last chapter from Death of Charlotte to Last Day, and worked with Garth Williams to illustrate the book. Harper ordered a first printing of 50,000 copies and heavily advertised a month before its publication on October 15, 1952. Reviews glowed. Eudora Welty said,
"The book has grace and humor and praise of life, and the good backbone of succinctness that only the most highly imaginative stories seem to grow. It's an adorable book about life and death, trust and treachery, pleasure and pain, and the passing of time."
Pamela Travers, who authored Mary Poppins, said the book had tangible magic. In 1976, when Publishers Weekly polled teachers, librarians, and authors, asking them to name the 10 best children's books written in America since 1776, Charlotte's Web was number 1. White was pleased. In 1953, he published another selection of pieces from The New Yorker called The Second Tree from the Corner, marking the end of another chapter in his life. In 1954, Joel graduated from MIT in naval architecture. He was married with 2 children and drafted into the Army. By the end of the year, he and his family were shipped to Germany, where he was stationed. White received an honorary degree from Harvard the same year. He was also asked by the Yale Review to write an essay to commemorate the 100th year anniversary of Thoreau's Walden. Walden, according to White, was the only book he owned. To him, Thoreau is a writer not trying to act like a writer. White admits Thoreau is a poser, but the pose was struck not for other people to study, but for Thoreau to study. He was both artist and model, examining his own position in relation to society and nature. When Harold Ross died in 1951, during an operation to remove one of his lungs, William Shawn stepped up as editor-in-chief. Within a few years, Catherine reclaimed her position as head of the fiction department. But by 1957, Catherine gave it up. Joel was back living in Maine, building boats, and White and Catherine moved out of Turtle Bay Gardens to spend time with the family. In Maine, White wrote in the boathouse, the same size as Thoreau's, on Walden Pond, 10 feet by 15. Although Catherine gave up her post, she still continued editorial work part-time. One day, an old friend sent White a first edition 1918 copy of the late William Strunk Jr.'s Elements of Style. White was so delighted he wrote an affectionate piece for The New Yorker.
I think that if I suddenly found myself in the, to me, unthinkable position of facing a class in English usage and style, I would simply lean far out over the desk, clutch my lapels, blink my eyes, and say, "Get the little book! Get the little book! Get the little book!"
Since Strunk's copyright had expired, editor Jack Case at Macmillan wanted to reissue the book. Case asked White if he could use White's essay as an introduction. White said yes, but would like to revise the essay for its new audience. Case proposed that White revise Strunk's entire text and that Macmillan publish a new edition by William Strunk Jr. and E.B. White. White agreed on one condition. Even though Strunk's copyright on the book had run out, White insisted Macmillan contact Strunk's family for approval and that Macmillan pay them any royalties. Macmillan agreed to the terms. In the revision, White found some of Strunk's instructions too pedantic and encouraged young writers to occasionally deviate from them and to trust their ear. He thought, too, that parts of the sections on composition were narrow and bewildering. He also redid some of Strunk's examples. Regarding Strunk's rule that a relative pronoun should come immediately after its antecedent, he provided the following before and after examples. Before, he wrote 3 articles about his adventures in Spain, which were published in Harper's Magazine. Strunk's after. He published in Harper's Magazine 3 articles about his adventures in Spain. White's after. He published 3 articles in Harper's Magazine about his adventures in Spain. In the essay, An Approach to Style, White implies some advice that few textbooks or teachers ever give. Be considerate of your readers, but write to please yourself. Prior to publishing, Macmillan sent copies of it to several teachers of English composition for criticism and suggestions. The teachers replied that Strunk and White were too prescriptive about certain rules of English usage. They recommended White bring the manuscript more into tune with modern educational theory. When Case informed White of this, White said no.
I was saddened by your letter, the flagging spirit, the moistened finger in the wind, the examination of entrails, and the fear of little men. I don't know whether Macmillan is running scared or not, but I do know that this book is the work of a dead precisionist and a half-dead disciple of his, and that it has got to stay that way.
Case looked up from White's letter with a broad grin. The rules stayed. The book was released in 1959. By 1982, it had sold 5.5 million copies and was made required reading in thousands of colleges across America. In 1961, Catherine retired from The New Yorker. Shortly thereafter, she had severe headaches and an appendectomy. This was followed by a blocked carotid artery that required another operation. In 1964, she was treated for dermatitis so severe her skin couldn't tolerate the pressure of clothing. In 1969, she was suffering from osteoporosis of the spine, caused by the side effect of the drugs they had given her to help her dermatitis. Her ill health colored almost all aspects of the Whites' life together. In 1962, Harper and Row published The Points of My Compass, a collection of White's New Yorker essays written during the last 7 years. In 1963, JFK named White to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. When Western Union relayed the message, Catherine thought it was a joke. Due to White's anxiety, he skipped the official ceremony. Instead, a smaller gathering was held, and he was presented the award by Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine. White said it was the greatest achievement of his life. In 1968, White settled down to complete his 3rd children's story, The Trumpet of the Swan. He was still collecting $7,500 a year for Charlotte's Web, spread out to avoid taxes. He would eventually withdraw $500,000 in royalties in 1979, but he didn't know what the future held and wanted to make sure Catherine was well provided for. The Trumpet of the Swan tells the story of Lewis, a trumpeter swan born without a voice. He has no means of talking to his fellow swans, but with the help of Sam Beaver, an 11-year-old boy, he goes to school and learns to read and write. Using a slate of chalk, Lewis is able to communicate with people, if not swans. Lewis's father crash dives through the show window of a music store and steals a trumpet, so that Lewis can speak through that. Before Lewis can win the heart of the swan he loves, he sets out to save the honor of his father by earning enough money to reimburse the music store. Published in 1970, the book appeared at number 1 on the New York Times bestsellers list in children's books in 1971. Number 2 was Charlotte's Web. In 1972, White and Catherine began to help White's goddaughter, Dorothy Lebrano Guth, gather and edit material that would become Letters of E.B. White, a massive undertaking. But well worth it. The book was released in 1976. 55,000 copies were printed. This new attention triggered hundreds of letters of fan mail from children who'd read Charlotte's Web that were now in their 30s. Catherine, however, was deteriorating. She'd had 4 heart seizures and failing vision, but she didn't let it lower her spirits. Only when her eyesight got so bad she couldn't read anymore did she grow bitter. On the day of her death, July 20th, 1977, White sat on a small stool just inside the door of the intensive care unit and watched the heart rate monitor send its tiny, bright signals of doom. Her children and 5 grandchildren attended the funeral. White did not. His tribute would be an oak tree planted at her grave and an introduction to her collection of essays on gardening. White developed arthritis and had spells of arrhythmia, but he was more or less in good health. However, the house seemed empty, and his days were lonely. At times, he felt desolate. His circle of friends was dead or dying. Catherine had been the social butterfly of the two, the one who organized dinners. With her gone, he became an elderly recluse. His main friend became Corona McAmur, his editor at Harper & Row, who'd helped him assemble Letters of E.B. White for publication. When it came time to assemble poems and sketches, White drove with Corona down to Florida to swim and compile the book. In 1980, for his 81st birthday, he invited her to go canoeing at Great Pond, the same Belgrade lake where 70 years before he'd received a green Old Town canoe from his father. Her visits were but a few days a year, but White looked forward to them like a child looks forward to a circus. In his old age, White came to suffer from Alzheimer's. His son Joel would read to him.
Who wrote this?
Asked White. You did, Dad. White thought about this odd fact for a moment, then murmured,
Not bad. Not bad.
White died of the disease on October 1st, 1985, at the age of 86. He is buried beside his wife in Brooklyn Cemetery in Brooklyn, Maine. As for his legacy, he said that, all that I hope to say in books, all that I ever hope to say, is that I love the world. I guess you can find that in there, if you dig around. Hello, my name's Paul. Thanks for watching. Got the Trumpets of the Swans here with me today. One of the cool things about the biography I chose for this video is that E.B. White actually got to read it before he passed away. So that means that he would have been aware of everything that you just heard, to some extent. I also came upon his famous cocktail recipe, so if you guys are into gin and apricot brandy, I can throw that in the comments. If you're into fantasy, be sure to check out my book, Spitfire and the Objects of Desire. It's about the character Nayla, who's afraid of being seen, and she goes on a journey into the Greek underworld to find an object that will help her feel secure. The twist is the underworld is both Homer's underworld, which was a physical location, and Plato's underworld, which was a journey into the mind. And as Harold Ross would say at the end of his New Yorker meetings after cursing up a storm, God bless.